My favorite part of Pacific Rim Uprising was the credits. And no, that's not a joke about how I was glad it was over, although, believe me, I was glad this movie was over. No, but as I was sitting in the post-movie glow, composing a sarcastic tweet about the profound disappointment I'd just suffered through, I looked up and was pleasantly surprised to see the names of all the digital artists who worked on the film scrolling by. Animators and visual effects artists do not get nearly enough respect and recognition from Hollywood, even when their work is absolutely vital to the success of a film. So, credit where credit is due to Universal and Legendary Pictures for giving, credit where credit is due. I hope that other Hollywood studios follow suit. That said, to all of the big Hollywood execs who I'm sure are watching this video right now, please do not copy anything else from this movie. Please. Pacific Rim Uprising is a goddamn train wreck. And I cannot tell you how much it hurts me to say that. The original Pacific Rim is one of my all-time favorite movies, for what will be obvious reasons to anyone who's familiar with my content. That film was a love letter from Guillermo del Toro and writer Travis Beacham to mecha anime and giant monster films. It is to Gundam and Godzilla what The Matrix is to Ghost in the Shell and Akira. With Pacific Rim, del Toro had the ambitious goal of creating something totally original that still wore its love for its forebearers on its sleeve. He aimed to both add new ideas to the mecha and kaiju genres and create an accessible jumping on point for those unfamiliar with them. And I'd say he succeeded. There's no kaiju film quite like Pacific Rim, and no mecha story in basically any medium that better sells the unfathomable scale, power, and weight of a skyscraper-sized robot. It was a real work of creative vision, and not a shred of that vision remains in Stephen DeKnight's sequel, which, by the way, I am about to spoil the shit out of, so now's your cue to leave if you still want to see Pacific Rim Uprising. Although, trust me, you don't. With that said, unlike other films that I've talked about recently, I can't exactly argue that Uprising is unfaithful to its anime roots. With a new lineup of mostly teenage protagonists and an array of new monsters for them to fight with their shiny, new, highly marketable robots, it's arguably closer in tone and subject matter to most mecha anime than what Del Toro made. That is to say, its primary purpose is to sell lots and lots of action figures to small children, with silly things like fight choreography and storytelling taking a backseat to important stuff like making sure that every robot gets at least 30 seconds to look cool for TV spots. There's even a moment when the film's teenage secondary lead, Amara, who's a 14-year-old genius who built her own mini Jaeger out of spare parts because of course she is, pauses to excitedly point out each toy, Jaeger, in the movie, one by one, as the camera pans slowly across their faces. This film seriously spends more time making sure you remember the name of each and every cool robot that you can buy at a toy store near you than it does dwelling on the death of Mako. Yes, Rinko Kikuchi's character, who was arguably the heart and soul of the original movie, is killed off within the first 30 minutes of this sequel. And her brother, John Boyega's character, spends like 15 seconds pressing F to pay respects in front of her casket before moving on with the plot. I'm pretty sure he doesn't even cry. Which is especially ridiculous because she dies directly in front of him. Like, her helicopter is crashing and he dives in with the Zeta Gundam, Gypsy Avenger, reaching out to grab her and just barely missing, which is just as well since colliding with his truck-sized fingers would have been as likely to make the chopper explode as hitting the pavement anyway. The whole scene is the same kind of hilariously stupid as the desperately grasping web fingers just missing Gwen Stacy in Amazing Spider-Man 2. And it's made even worse by the fact that they don't treat it with anything resembling the gravity that it deserves. Do you remember Idris Elba's sacrifice at the end of the first movie? How it felt genuinely moving and heartbreaking, but also necessary? Don't you think that one of the last film's protagonists should get the same treatment? Fuck that shit! Sad people don't buy toys! That's objectively not true. Well, okay, to be fair, not every movie has to strive to make us love its characters and feel for their losses. Del Toro himself cut over an hour of character development from the original movie, saying we cannot pretend that we are making Ibsen with giant robots and monsters. But when the protagonist of the first movie dies in your sequel, I should feel fucking something. Come on! especially when the core underlying theme of the original movie is how people cope with loss and deal with survivor's guilt. Especially when that theme is specifically the core driving motivation of the fucking character you just fucking killed off. It is an insult, an actual insult, that Mako's death is given less thought by the characters and script than the inner workings of the cool evil double sword robot with a kaiju brain. I kept waiting for them to bring it back, because painful memories interfering with drift compatibility is one of the core emotional conceits of the whole franchise. I thought that Boyega would get into a robot and freeze up thinking about his dead sister, especially after Amara has her own painful flashback of her family dying in front of her, but then they never bring it up. The closest they get is Boyega hesitating a bit when he reaches out his hand one time. Now that I think about it, they never actually deal with Amara's trauma either. She gets in a simulator with John Boyega early in the film and ruins the drift by getting lost in a memory, but then when she has to pilot a giant robot to save the world because all of the adults are conveniently incapacitated, of course, she's totally fine. Like, he gives her a 2-word pep talk and presto changeo, no more PTSD. Although I guess I'd be pretty fast to get over the death of my parents too if it was half as hilarious as what happens to Amara's. She's at what looks like Santa Monica Pier taking Polaroids with them, then she walks over and looks at the water for like 3 seconds, and when she looks back up, an 80-foot kaiju is looming over the whole pier, like it somehow snuck up on everyone there despite being taller than the water around the pier is deep. Then it crashes through the dock and separates her from her family, and while they're screaming for her to jump across, it just steps on them. Like, all of them, at once. There's like 6 of them all grouped up on the broken pier. The dad doesn't even think to send his wife and other kids running, and the foot just lands on them with framing and timing that, honest to God, reminded me of the Monty Python opening. There were times when I genuinely could not tell if this movie was fucking with me or not. Like, when they're riding into battle and one of the cadets pulls up the Trololo song on YouTube. I'm dead serious. That's a thing that happens in this movie. I couldn't make that up if I tried. It seems more likely that this is just bad writing, though. Like, Amara's drift compatibility issues are only in the movie as an excuse to cram in that flashback. But it's weird that the film mostly ignores that core issue for Jaeger pilots with its actual characters, since the plot of the movie is primarily driven by a tech company trying to make remote one-pilot Jaeger replacements because drift compatibility is so rare, and the 2-pilot system is just generally inconvenient and full of problems. Problems that, again, never meaningfully affect the characters or the forward momentum of the plot. It's almost like the people writing this movie forgot to talk to the people writing this movie. Actually, with 4 credited writers and probably more uncredited rewrites in addition to that, that might be closer to the truth than it sounds. And even if you can ignore the lack of heart and thematic inconsistencies, the plot of this movie is just a fucking mess. The original Pacific Rim worked so well because there wasn't much to its concept. Humanity's under siege from giant monsters, and the only way to stop them is with giant robots. Those giant robots need 2 mind-linked pilots, so the 2 best pilots need to work out their differences and come to grips with their personal issues to save the world. It's a simple plot that leaves plenty of room for both big action scenes and a bit of character drama. The plot of Uprising is, well, not so simple. So, 10 years after Idris Elba sacrificed himself to stop the kaiju, the Jaeger program is still going just in case they come back. The army is training teenagers to be pilots because you make stronger bonds when you're younger, but that program may come to an end because Charlie Day and a Chinese lady named Xiao are building remote drones that only need 1 pilot. So, the UN is gonna vote on whether to use the drones or the Jaegers, and Mako has the tie-breaking vote, but then an evil Jaeger shows up and kills her. So suddenly the drones are being rushed into production, and while that's happening, Boyega and Clint Eastwood's son find and kill the evil Jaeger, and it turns out that it's being driven by an artificial kaiju brain. It turns out that Xiao made parts of that Jaeger, so everyone thinks that she staged the attack to get people behind her drone program, but then it turns out that Charlie Day was actually mind-controlled when he drifted with the kaiju brain in the first movie, and he secretly programmed all of the drones to turn into monsters and open up breaches around the world so the kaiju can come through and destroy it. And also, he somehow secretly built a half kaiju, half robot that looks nothing like the other drones on their assembly line without anyone noticing. Alright, I'm done nitpicking. Xiao shuts down the drones by hacking them, which is a bit anticlimactic, but 3 kaiju make it through and they're all headed toward Mount Fuji because it turns out that all along they were supposed to dive into that specific volcano so their rocket fuel blood could react to the rare earth magma inside and start a chain reaction blowing up every volcano on the Pacific Rim and terraforming the Earth and Okay, one more nitpick. That doesn't make any fucking sense! The big retcon twist of the movie is that the kaiju weren't trying to attack cities, they were just going through them on their way to Mount Fuji. But, like, here's Japan, here's the breach, and here's where the first kaiju went when it came out of the breach. That kaiju literally could not have picked a less direct route to get where it was going. It has to go around the entire globe, crossing the entirety of North America, Europe, and Asia to reach a target that's basically right next to where it started. This movie is so fucking dumb. But putting aside those more specific complaints, the bigger problem with this plot is that there's just way too much of it. It feels like my attention's being pulled in 20 different directions at once, and it's impossible to appreciate any of it. Like the subplot with the love triangle that ends with the girl implying she's down for a devil's three-way, which would be great in any other movie, but in this one, I literally forgot that it happened until I was recording this. I didn't even write it in the script. This is an ad-lib. There are some good ideas in this script. I think that Bern Gornum would probably have made a better villain than Charlie Day, but having one of them turn evil because of their drift with the kaiju is a neat concept. And the drone program could have brought up interesting themes of depersonalized warfare, making a strong contrast with the human focus of the first movie, but it just doesn't have the time to. None of the 7 different plots running in this movie have any time to develop, and they never really bounce off each other either. But you know what the worst part of it is? I could forgive all of this, the rampant commercialism, the terrible plotting, and the awful writing, if the action was good. But it's just not. At least, not for Pacific Rim. Aside from a few brief moments, the Jaegers and kaiju have lost the sense of scale and weight that they had in the original. When you watched Pacific Rim, it really felt like there were massive robot feet crashing down on the street right in front of you, but Uprising loses most of those ground level shots, and the sound design and effects are neutered to the point that even when they do happen, they just don't have that impact. The robots and monsters alternate between feeling like dudes in suits on cardboard sets and cartoon characters. All of the heavy, for lack of a better word, realism is just gone. And it doesn't help that the fight choreography kinda sucks. If you enjoy the Transformers films, like this movie's new primary audience in China does, then you may get a kick out of this chaotic, senseless style of action. But if you like Pacific Rim, you probably won't. There's a moment where a Jaeger flips off a downed kaiju while looking directly into the camera, and it kind of felt like that was personally directed at me and other fans. Which brings up another problem. Uprising is absolutely drenched in the snarky quips and disaffected sarcasm that passes for humor in Hollywood these days. It's very cynical, which would be fine, except that Pacific Rim was specifically made to oppose Hollywood cynicism with earnest, unironic passion. It's a total mismatch in tone that shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what this series is all about. But beyond the bad fights, the sloppy writing, and the incongruous tone, the loss of Pacific Rim's identity is perhaps best exemplified by the Gundam Unicorn cameo. Yes, really. Ignoring the fact that the Gundam statue Gypsy Avenger lands next to isn't actually in that part of Tokyo, not to mention that it wouldn't exist because the first kaiju attack on Tokyo happened a year before it was built, Guillermo del Toro went out of his way to avoid borrowing from other mecha and kaiju films because he wanted Pacific Rim to have its own identity instead of just being another genre film. He instructed his production designers to explicitly avoid drawing from Godzilla and other monster movies in creating the kaiju, while the mecha designs were based on real-world sources like architecture and vehicles rather than other robots. The closest thing to a direct reference in the original movie is the Serizawa scale, named for a doctor from the original Godzilla. There is nothing like that Gundam statue in that movie. By going out of its way to fillet Gundam, Uprising completely undermines that principle and threatens to transform Pacific Rim from a distinctive original IP into yet another nostalgia trip. And with Ready Player One coming out like next fucking week, we really don't need 2 of those. I can see somebody really enjoying or even loving this movie. The guys next to me in the theater seem to be having a blast with it, and Gaijin Goomba told me that he likes it. I don't think that this is necessarily a terrible or even bad movie, but it is definitely a terrible sequel. One of the worst that I've ever had the displeasure of sitting through. And right now, I just wish that I could go back to 2013, look young Geoff in the eye, and say, trust me, You'd rather have nothing than more Pacific Rim. Also buy Bitcoin. I'm Geoff Thew, professional shitbag, signing out from my mother's basement.